Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bahran. I'm here in my Egyptian loving home here in London, talking about the coronavirus and things that simply do not add up. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at a few extremely odd things about this virus. Mortality rate. Mortality rate for ordinary flu is 0.1%. Now you can Google all this. This information is widely available. It is thought that this virus is 10 to 20 times more virulent and more fatality rate. And a figure of 1% has been mentioned, a figure of 2% has been mentioned. Now, there's a few things that are extremely odd about this, and it is just boggling my brain. First thing, I've just found out that the mortality rate in China was highly, highly exaggerated. And they've just admitted that, and it seems the mortality rate is far, far lower than it actually was. But let's look at it logically. Um, of the of the people who are diagnosed, not everybody who has the virus is going to be diagnosed, first of all. In fact, most people, a lot of, especially younger people, whom it doesn't seem to affect so much, can carry on as normal, have the virus, and show no symptoms whatsoever. So the mortality rate, not just the mortality rate, the detection rate is the people, A, whom they suspect of having it, and B, whom they've tested for it. So if you take into account people who have it and show no symptoms, which is probably going to be a huge, huge number of people. Secondly, people who have it and don't get tested for various reasons. One of those reasons is people don't want to get locked down. They don't want to end up in hospital. Or they think it might be just ordinary flu, or they're just scared that their family is going to get locked down. Therefore, the number of people who have it is far, far, far more than the number of people who've been diagnosed to have it. Therefore, the mortality rate, instead of being 1% or 2%, is actually likely to be much, much, much lower than that, rather like seasonal flu. So, seasonal flu, 0.1%. This one, 1 to 2% of the people who've been diagnosed, not the people who are suspected to having it. But the media does not seem to make this quite clear. So this seems to me, to be a panic reaction, widely, widely, widely exaggerated. Now let's look at a few other facts. The economic damage I'll come to that in a minute. Mortality rates. In South Korea seems to be, this is of the people who've been diagnosed, not the people who have. The mortality rate of the people who've been diagnosed in South Korea seems to be around 1 in 200. Now remember, for that, there will be many others who would have been infected but are not tested. So that makes it very similar to normal seasonal flu. As I said, in China, they've revised the figures and they think the mortality rate is far lower. Now, in Italy, from what we've been told, it's around 8%. Now, that to me does not make any sense whatsoever. So, this is one of the odd things about this virus that I'm extremely puzzled about. Now, let's look at other odd things. Iran, with a population of 83 million people, just a few days ago, 2 or 3 days ago, had over 10,000 cases. 10,000 cases. Right next door in Turkey, number of cases was one or two with a similar population. Turkey has about 83, 84 million people. So two countries, almost exactly the same population, right next door to each other. There's travel between Iran and Turkey all the time. There's railway links, there's road links, there's air links. There's constant travel between the two countries. One country has over 10,000 cases. Next door has one or two. India, slightly further away, with 20 times the population of Iran, has 72, at least 2 or 3 days ago. Does that make any sense to you? Pakistan had a handful. The other Gulf countries have a handful. Now that is extremely, extremely odd. That is a statistical nonsense if this story we're being told is actuality or fact. So you've got these extremely wild fluctuations in the countries with the cases that they have it. Secondly, you've got the mortality rate that is highly, highly, highly dubious and questionable. Thirdly, I'm going to come to the main point, the economic shutdown, which is extremely strange to me. Now, for those who don't understand this, economic shutdowns have severe, severe consequences for the health of a nation. To give you an example, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, the average life expectancy for men was very similar to the West. For men, it was around 72, 73 years of age. For the Soviet Union, it was 69 years of age. When the Soviet Union broke up, in other words, when the economy collapsed, within a short time, the mortality, the average life expectancy for men dropped down to 56. So from 69 to 56 as a result of economic collapse and depression. This is what we're facing now. That means that several million people lost their lives over a few year period or because of the economic collapse in one country of just over 100 million people. Now, the United States alone has got 320 million people. You've got shutdowns all around the world. The number of deaths, extra deaths, due to this economic slowdown and this economic collapse, you could say, is going to run in the millions. You can be guaranteed of that. Absolutely guaranteed of that. Now, use your common sense. In the Soviet Union, when the mortality went up, the reason for the mortality was healthcare. Access to healthcare became more difficult. But the main reason was people were stressed. Because in the Soviet Union, I'm not saying the system was better, but I'm saying in the Soviet Union, they had free healthcare, free accommodation, free education, everything was free. Suddenly, your job was no longer for life. And if you lost your job, there was no meaningful social security, which meant that there was an extreme amount of stress, and especially men. It's a very macho culture. So men were under an extreme amount of stress over their economic situation. That put a lot of stress on their heart. Extra number of deaths due to heart attacks, strokes. But the main thing, the stress caused people to turn to alcoholism. And the alcoholism in Russia went through the roof. Literally millions and millions of people, extra number of people died from alcohol illnesses and deaths related to alcoholism. Now, if you doubt this in any way, shape, or form, please Google it, look it up. I don't make any statements without having done the research first. So what I am saying is the stress due to this economic slowdown, you can call it, it's already a depression. The share prices have collapsed. Now, remember, there's also going to be stress on the mental. More people are going to commit suicide. There's going to be more because families are going to spend more time together. There's going to be more domestic violence. There's going to be more suicides. There's going to be more people's blood pressure is going to go up, um, leading to more heart attacks and so on. More cases of severe depression. So there's going to be far, far more deaths from the economic collapse than the virus itself. Now, let's look at the deaths from the virus. In any ordinary year, flu kills around 7.5 million people a year. 7.5 million. Sorry, I beg your pardon. 750,000 people a year, of which around in Britain we have about 7,500 deaths. Now, let's just assume that this virus is 10 times more virulent than seasonal flu, which is what the mainstream media is telling us, without actually taking into account the issues that I talked about in terms of people having it but not being diagnosed. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, not only that it's 10 times more, let's say it's 15 times more people, more dangerous, and the mortality rate is 15 times more than seasonal flu. So 15 times 700,000 is about 10 million. So we're talking about, at the very most, 10 million deaths due to this virus. Let's put this into context. 10 million deaths in a population of the planet of 8.3 billion people. That's 8,300 million people. 10 million people. I know it sounds horrible, but it's a drop in the ocean. Now you're looking at economic collapse. The economic collapse due to this virus, I guarantee you, will kill far more people than 10 million people. I guarantee it. Therefore, this whole scenario, and this is the worst case, probably the worst case scenario. Now, so we're looking at the economic situation. I mentioned the Soviet Union and how the life expectancy for men collapsed. Um, I'm sure it will be similar for women. So I should imagine a similar scenario would happen around the world, especially in extremely poor countries. Now remember, a large number of people around the world, especially African countries, if you shut them down, they're literally on the verge of survival. If you shut them down, the mortality is going to be far higher than the mortality rate in rich Western country. So this whole scenario does not make any sense to me whatsoever. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the virus is slowed down. They talk about the graph. You have the high peak that is expected to be the journey of the virus. They want to flatten that peak to make it over a longer period of time so that the health service can be able to cope with this. Now, this does not make any sense because if the peak is going to be flatter but over a longer period of time, rather than a sharp rise and a sharp fall, to me that says a logical thing is that roughly the same number of people are going to die from it. So the whole purpose of shutting down is to delay the number of illnesses and deaths rather than cut them down, cut the number of deaths down. Because one way or the other, the people who are prevented from having it now will, over a longer period of time, somehow get the virus one way or the other. Because you cannot completely protect people from this virus. It's going to be impossible to completely protect these people from virus. It just means it just takes longer for them to at some point get it, and at some point, unfortunately, to succumb to it. That's for the vulnerable people. So, if the whole purpose of this shutdown is for the health system to cope, then that doesn't make any sense, because what you could do is you can make, rather than shutting down the entire economy, you can make extra provisions for the health system. So in Britain, for example, the NHS is struggling. We know that. So what can we do to find creative ways of being able to cope with the new cases? For me, it's very easy. You've got cruise ships. I've been on cruise ships a few times. You've got cruise ships that are now lying um, empty um, around the world. These cruise ships have got single cabins. That means each patient is going to be isolated from other patients. In effect, they would have their own rooms. So you put people who are very ill in the cruise ships, or abandoned hospitals, or you convert schools. And inside the schools or in large halls, you section people off so they have their privacy, and also they're separated from the other patients. And you treat the people with the new extra ventilators, and you also, of course, have to use hygiene methods and so on. So I would estimate an extra 30 to 40 billion pounds temporarily on the NHS for the extra number of cases, especially use the cruise ships as makeshift hospitals. And these cruise ships are enormous. I mean, some of them can hold 7,000 people at a time. And that would improve the NHS's capacity. And they can do that around the world. So in this way, and they could pay the cruise liners. In this way, both the cruise liners will survive this catastrophe, and the NHS will be able to help the patients. And we will not have we will not should shut down the entire economy and face economic collapse. So these are very, very simple questions. It's just creative ways of dealing with the situation now, to prevent a bigger catastrophe from the economic meltdown. Why they're not doing this, I don't know. Now, another thing I wanted to say, if you shield the population too much, it could very well mean that the virus could come back again in 6 months' time, when the real crisis begins in the winter season. At the moment, we're approaching spring, and then we'll have summer. But if you protect the population too much and the virus makes a comeback, this time when it makes the comeback, it could be far more virulent and far more deadly. Viruses in general and pandemics need to do what they need to do. It's like trying to stop the wind. You cannot stop the wind. They will do what they need to do. Um, this kind of virus I'm talking about, cold viruses. Obviously, I'm not talking about HIV and things like that, which you can curtail by people's behavior and so on. But this one, a certain amount of immunity, a certain amount of, if you want to call it herd immunity, whatever you want to call it, um, needs to be had in order for the virus to become inert. It will do what it needs to do. In terms of the shape of the shape of the curve can be sharp rise and a short drop, or a more flatter curve. But if you actually measure the number of people that will become ill and die, it will be roughly the same. So basically, what they're doing is collapsing the world economy in order to buy time. I'm saying you don't need to collapse the world economy. You can have creative ways of the extra number of patients by letting the virus run its course, whilst at the same time targeting the vulnerable groups and asking them to stay at home, but not shutting down the entire economy. If you do that and do creative ways of dealing with the crisis, such as convert cruise ships into mobile hospitals, I think we can deal with this. So, thank you very much for listening, and I would appreciate your comments. Thank you.